In this video, I will attempt to better explain position absolute. So this is slightly more complicated than position relative, but it's mostly because of the sense of context that position absolute requires. So first, let's look at what I've got here. So I've got an index.html file. It's very simple, and I've got an h1, which is just a label for the top. Then I have three divs, which are nested. So if you look, wrapper is the parent div, its immediate child is inner, and then the child of inner is the p. They don't have anything in them. I'm just using them as boxes. So if we look here, I just made the h1 a little bit smaller, just so it doesn't eat up so much screen real estate. Then the wrapper has a width and height of 400 pixels. It has padding of 50 pixels. The padding is what's creating this around here. Margin of 30 pixels auto, so the 30 pixels pushes it down, auto centers it up on the screen, and it is the light gray background. So wrapper is this one, the largest square. Inner also has a width and a height of 400 pixels, but no padding, and a slightly darker background just so it's visible. I don't want it to be invisible and confusing. So the sense here is that wrapper is the parent, as you can see. Inner is its child and sits directly inside of it. And then the child of inner is the P, which is width and height of 100, a little bit of margin bottom, which is really useful in this example, so I'll get rid of it. And it has a background of red. So we're going to talk about what position absolute will do to this red square. So the very first thing I want to do is explain that position absolute requires context. So it's gonna, when I say absolute, it's gonna absolutely position itself relative to whatever parent in its hierarchy is also positioned. So what that means is that this tag, the p tag, once I make it position absolute, it will go through its hierarchy. It will look at inner, and it'll say, hey, is this thing positioned? Because if this is positioned, this is going to be my context. If this is not positioned, then it'll go up to the next one and say, is this positioned? Because if this is positioned, then I want it to be my context. And if this is not positioned, it will always default to body. So that may seem a little confusing now, but it will make more sense once we start looking at it. So the very first thing we're going to do is just give this position absolute and save. So I'm not going to give any top or bottom value or anything like that. I just want to see what this will do. So let's reload the page. It does nothing. But it does have a position of absolute. So now the way that it renders is different. So the very first thing I want to do is give it a value, a left value of 0. So what this will do is it will say whichever parent element in my hierarchy is positioned, I want to go all the way to the left of it because I want to be 0 pixels away from the left of that particular parent element. So it'll say, has this been positioned? Has this been positioned? And then it'll default to this. And so it's going to go all the way to the left of whatever element is positioned, and it's going to be 0 pixels away from the left-hand side of that. So if I reload this page, you'll notice that it cut all the way to the edge of the screen. Now that's because neither inner or wrapper have been positioned at all. So because of that, it has defaulted to body, and body's width is the width of the screen. So it can't use inner as its context, and it can't use wrapper as its context, so it uses body. So when I say go to the left side of my context and be 0 pixels away from that left-hand side, it just goes all the way to the edge. So let's see what we can do to affect that behavior. So the very first thing I'll do is I'll give position relative to the wrapper. Now there are good reasons why you would use position relative to give this to make this the context. The main one being that by applying position relative, so long as I don't apply top, left, bottom, or right value to wrapper, it'll just stay exactly where it would be if it were static. It won't affect anything in the way that this element is rendered. But now, because it is positioned, it can be the context for this absolutely positioned child. So let's save this and reload this. So notice that I did not change the value of left for the p tag. It's still left 0. So when I say left 0 on a position absolute element, that says whichever element is the context for my positioning, I want to be 0 pixels from the left of that element. So because the parent element that is positioned, the nearest parent element that is positioned is wrapper, it treats wrapper, which is this light gray element, as the context. So it says, hey wrapper, I want to be all the way to the left-hand side of you, and I want to be 0 pixels away from the left-hand side. So if I say 10 pixels, that's going to push it 10 pixels away from the left-hand edge of wrapper. So if I reload, see, it's now 10 pixels away from that. So if I do, say, top of 10 pixels and reload, it's now 10 pixels from the top of wrapper. So let's recap what this means. So I've given this a position of absolute. I've given a left value of 10 pixels and a top value of 10 pixels. And these values refer to the top and left of the context for positioning. So the way that it determines context for positioning is it goes to its immediate parent and says, has this been positioned? If the answer is no, then it goes to its parent's parent and says, has this been positioned? If the answer is no, then it will default to body. So in this case, it looks at inner first and says, has this element been positioned? The answer is no, because there's no positioning on this element. So it says, okay, well, what is the parent of inner? And the parent of inner is wrapper. So then it looks at the styles of wrapper and says, has this been positioned? And because the answer is yes, this is now the context for positioning for the class of P. So then it says, okay, well, good. This is now the context for positioning. So wherever this thing is, wherever its left-hand side and top are, I'm going to use my positioning based upon that. So it says I want to be 10 pixels from the top of wrapper, and I want to be 10 pixels from the left of wrapper, which puts it here. 10 pixels from the top and 10 pixels from the left. So now let's say, okay, cool. Now we're going to give this a class of, a position of relative. So this will now change where it goes. So I want you to just take a second and think about where this might end up. Now that this has a position of relative, you can like pause this video and think about where is the square going to be now that class of inner has a position relative on it. So let's think about that. How does class of P determine its context for positioning? It goes to its parent and checks to see if that parent is positioned. And if it isn't, it goes to its parent's parent and its parent's parent's parent all the way up to body. So if none of those are positioned, it'll default to body. So this is the thing that has a position of absolute. So the first thing it does, it says, hey, is this positioned? Well, now it is. In fact, it is. So because this is now positioned, its new context for positioning is going to be the dark gray box. So let's save our file and reload. So now, because the dark gray box, which is inner, this class of inner, has a position relative applied to it, that now becomes the new context for positioning for the red square. So we can control, not without even changing these values at all, where this thing's up. We can say we want it to be relative to this box or relative to this box or relative to the body, just by making sure that we are controlling which element is actually positioned. So if I want it to be relative to the body, I just remove positioning from the parents. So now none of these things are positioned, so it'll default to body. So if I save this, it's now going to be 10 pixels from the top of the screen and 10 pixels from the left of the screen. If I want the square to be relative to this box, which is class of wrapper, then I would then go to the wrapper element and give this a position relative, save. And now when I save this and reload, it'll now be relative to that element because that is the nearest parent element that is also positioned. So this is the thing that's position absolute. This is now position relative, so this is the context. If I want the context to be inner, which would be the immediate parent of P, then I would then style this with a position relative. So now this becomes the context for positioning for P. So if I reload this, it's now the gray square, the dark gray square, because that is the one that has position applied to it. So if I do both, let's just say for the sake of talking that wrapper and inner both have a position relative on them. it will use the nearest parent. So P will check inner first. If this is not positioned, then it will check wrapper. So in this case, inner is positioned, see? So it just will stop. It won't even check to see if wrapper is there. So it's going to use this, and we can just delete this. So if we save this with both of them, you'll notice that it stays on inner. If I remove this from wrapper, it stays on inner. The only way it'll use wrapper is if this is position, relative, and this one is not. In other words, if P checks inner and inner fails to be positioned, then it'll check wrapper. That is pretty much it.